Yuma, Dawa Nuna, Darawa Nunawel. In the words of the Ngunnawal people, this is Ngunnawal land. My name is Rebecca Vassarotti, the ACT Greens member for Kurrajong, and I'm here with Andrew Braddock, and it's fantastic to be coming here from Ngunnawal land. Andrew.
Yes, it is. It's beautiful being here in ACT Greens headquarters here in Lonsdale Street in Braddon, on Ngunnawal land. I'm Andrew Braddock. I'm the Green spokesperson for democracy. I'm really excited to have a chat tonight with Rebecca, just talking about what we're working on in this space about extending voting rights for 16 and 17-year-olds.
This is a really exciting initiative, and we thought that as part of this Greens talk, it'd be fantastic to find out a little bit more about what we're doing. The discussion around extending voting rights has been a conversation that we've been having in the Greens for a very long time, and it's very exciting to get it to this point. So, Andrew, are you able to explain a little bit what we're talking about when we talk about expanding voting rights to 16 and 17-year-olds?
Of course. Kerry Tucker was the Greens member who first introduced legislation to achieve this in 1996. And it's something that we've been campaigning quite hard on since then, because we know in the Assembly, you and I, we're making decisions that will affect the future of Canberra for generations to come. And we are deeply of the view that 16 and 17-year-olds who've proven to have the capability and capacity to be able to vote should be able to have a voice in that process. And so that's why we're really keen to be able to actually engage them in the political process by enfranchising them, so actually giving them the vote, so they can be involved, they can campaign, they can vote for the parties that they wish to see representing their views in the Assembly.
So we've seen some pretty amazing things that 16 and 17-year-olds have been doing over the last few years. Young people generally, whether it be the student strikes, we've seen young people actually take the Federal Environment Minister to court in terms of her duty to care, her duty to them in relation to climate change. But why 16 and 17-year-olds? Why have we sort of decided that that's a good place to start in terms of expanding voting rights?
Well, it's actually very interesting. It's due to neurological development, what they call hot and cold cognition. Now, cold cognition is the ability to make an informed, considered decision without the stresses of a time pressure, peer pressure, or emotional sort of context for that decision. And that perfectly describes what actually happens within a ballot box, where an individual, without any sort of social pressure around them, is able to make a choice based on their assessment of the different parties and what they're offering as to who they wish to put a one against. So that's a perfect example of how they actually have that demonstrated capacity on how to vote. And that's actually shown, that demonstrates that they actually have that capacity around the age of 15. So that's why we've decided on 16 as the most appropriate age to actually allow these people who have demonstrated capacity able to vote. Now, I also mentioned what is called hot cognition, and this is what often confuses people about whether 16 and 17-year-olds are ready for the vote. And this is the ability to make a good decision in a more pressured situation. It might be more time critical, it might be peer pressure, it might be involve more sort of social pressures coming into play, like in terms of drugs, alcohol, all of those sorts of things. That is what doesn't actually develop until about the age of 25. But that doesn't actually apply, because we don't need that sort of level of decision-making capacity to be actually able to make an informed, considered decision in the ballot box. So that's why it's so really intense for me, is I'm really keen to see those 16 and 17-year-olds. They have the capacity. Let's see them exercise that, but they should have a voice in our democracy.
So, in terms of engaging with this, I assume that you've been chatting a lot with young people. Do we actually know, do 16 and 17-year-olds want to vote? Are they interested in being enfranchised and being able to have their say at the ballot box?
Well, let's start with, it is not a homogenous group. You've got a spectrum from those who are deeply committed and engaged with the political process, and you might have seen some of those involved, like for example in School Strike for Climate. They're already engaged in democracy and the Assembly and have an intense interest. Two, you have the other end of the spectrum of 16 and 17-year-olds who have not the slightest level of engagement, no interest. But that's no different from the rest of the population. I'm sure we all know adults who would fit either one end of that spectrum to the other. And I think it's very important here, we don't try to hold these 16 and 17-year-olds to a higher standard what we actually expect the rest of the population to have. We don't expect adults to be educated and informed about their democracy. We automatically grant them the vote. We believe that it is critical as part of our compulsory voting system and democracy in Australia that everyone has their say because they have the capacity to. So why shouldn't 16 and 17-year-olds be caught up in that same level and not required to jump through further hoops just to be able to satisfy some of the views of older commentators, let's say?
And so when we've been talking about this, I know that I've heard, quite a bit of conversation about, people being genuinely concerned about, what happens if young people don't vote. We do have compulsory voting, and we do actually have a system of fines in terms of if you don't vote, you can get fined. And I know that is something that people, have really raised. So I'm wondering what happens in those cases in terms of, the proposal that we're putting forward. What are we going to do about that?
Well, I think firstly we need to be very clear. The current system involves a series of fines, which are $40 if you fail to vote, and should you fail to pay that fine, you end up in court anyway. And that applies across to everyone at 18 plus who's eligible to vote. So you often see large numbers of vulnerable people getting caught up in that process as well, which is a concern that I'm currently working on at the moment to see what we can do about that. The bill as proposed at the moment is looking at 16 and 17-year-olds still being required to take on the responsibilities of compulsory voting and participating in our democracy. Although we are looking to reduce that fine to a lower level, in this case $10, so they are still able to be engaged, they are still part of compulsory voting system. Now, I'm not disregarding in terms of I would not seek to fine or have young people ending up in the magistrates court. I'd much rather prefer everyone to get out and vote, exercise your voice. That is my reason for introducing this bill and what I would like to see. It's how we manage a system of enabling compulsory voting and encourages people to actually do that. Is the fine the most appropriate method? Is ending up in a magistrates court appropriate when someone is unable to pay that fine, whether it might be for financial disadvantage or any other disadvantage as well? These are questions that we're actually looking into right now in my office in the Assembly. I don't have the answers right yet, but we're definitely looking at what can we do to make sure that we're not seeing people being disadvantaged from this process as well.
Just picking up on some of the stuff that we were just talking about before, particularly around some of the commentators and what people say, I sort of hear a couple of arguments. One is that, young people will just vote the way their parents do. But another one that this is just a play from people on the progressive side of politics, just wanting to get people to vote that are more likely to vote that way. Yep. Have you what's the conversations that you've been having when you hear both those comments?
They are very amusing comments. I'll deal with the first one first. Look, I am sure there'll be some kids out there who will vote in accordance with what their parents dictate as to the way they should vote. Likewise, I am sure there are some kids out there who will deliberately vote against what their parents recommend. Because again, we're not talking about a homogenous group, we're talking about a range of people who have different perspectives, views, and that is no different from the adult population. I remember door knocking once in 2019 election, and a woman in her 40s, obviously she was well dressed, well educated by the way she spoke. She said, "Oh, don't worry about voting, I just vote how my husband tells me to." So we are again trying to hold young people to a higher standard that not necessarily adults adhere to at all times. And actually the commentators who often say these things, I'd say, they're usually the first ones to call for fines for individuals, for young people, if they do things like litter, put their feet on the seat of a bus, or engage in any other of those small antisocial behaviours. They've got no problem fining young people for these transgressions, but are suddenly very concerned at the idea that we might fine people for not taking their responsibility to democracy. So it's an interesting disconnect there. Now, to answer the second common criticism I've received from, let's say, the conservative commentators, is young people have a diversity of political views. As I said, some will vote in accordance with how their family has raised them, and I'd expect them to be voting in line with that. Others will be deeply radicalised and will be voting that way. It's a spectrum. I also note youth tend to get more radicalised actually when they leave school and go into university and they get exposed to more ideas and thinking. Whereas the young people in school, they've tended to be less less exposed to these ideas. So that's not necessarily the case. And we have no indication that sort of shows how are these young people actually going to vote. But if they vote, that is a great thing in itself because they have a say. They have an involvement in democracy. And what's really great about it is they start to get more engaged in democracy. We've often heard about how young people are getting turned off from democracy because they don't see it as representing them. They don't see a group of pale, stale males talking on the issues that they wish to see talked about. This is a great way to actually give them enfranchisement, give them power to actually have a say in that process. And it's actually demonstrated in overseas jurisdictions where they have lowered the voting age, where the level of engagement increases from young people. And not just a temporary blip, but it's a trend that actually lasts. Young people get in the habit of voting and they'll keep on voting for longer periods of time. So you're actually shown to increase turnout. It also increases the respect for the whole process of democracy and the government and the organisations that are behind that. These are all great things we want to instill in our young people. So hence this is a fantastic thing. That's why I'm here.
So actually, that's really interesting. Where are some of the other places where we do see 16 and 17-year-olds able to vote?
One's closest aligned to where we are examples like Scotland. They first introduced it as part of their independence referendum, and it's something they've continued as well. There's about 20 odd nations or subnational governments that have actually introduced it. Austria has been another example. So you've seen a lot of jurisdictions have actually started to implement this, which is fantastic. You're starting to see this body of academic evidence that's coming out where they've actually studied what are the impacts of actually giving the young people to vote. And those studies have actually shown there are no negatives they've found. They've actually found only positives in terms of youth attitudes towards democracy, engagement in the political process. So I think that's just absolute gold.
And we've actually seen here, even locally, academics throwing their weight behind this idea. Is that right?
Absolutely. The submissions that some of the academics provided to the inquiry were heavily referenced in terms of number of papers that they're referring to that show from numerous different perspectives, whether it might be from civic mindedness to the benefit to the education system to the rights of young people. They have demonstrated huge support for that, and I'm very grateful for them for that support. And they're very keen to actually see this happen within an Australian government as well. And so they see here in the ACT as the opportunity for us to actually potentially make this change. And so hence that's why they've been so involved in that process. And that was something that's interesting out of the whole process is you find the supporters have heavily documented, referenced academic articles and peer-reviewed journals supporting their arguments. Whereas you find those who are arguing against it, it tends to be based on anecdotes or opinions without any actual substance behind it. So it's been a really interesting process to go through.
Interestingly to hear that none of those jurisdictions have actually seen democracy fall, which is an interesting thing too, isn't it?
Well, exactly. Maybe America needs to give young people to vote and they might actually go up from where they are at rock bottom at the moment.
So, look, I don't know about you, but I get, every time I speak to a first-time voter, I get really excited, and it's a pretty exciting thing that we can take our votes for granted a little bit in this country, but it is a pretty precious thing. So, what happens now? Where to from here?
Well, we've gone through the committee process, which have examined the bill, and they've come up with a range of perspectives on it, which is really useful, and that's part of the benefit of that committee process. So Jonathan Davis and myself, who are the co-sponsors of the bill, we're taking that on board. We're going to be making amendments before we bring that back for actual debate in the Assembly. There are some policy issues, as I've mentioned before, in terms of how we deal with some of those disadvantaged people who get involved in this process. How can we make sure that we mitigate, minimise those impacts as much as possible? We are very keen to bring this forward before the end of the year because we'd love to be able to see the elections ACT actually able to roll this out in a seamless manner, because we do recognise it's going to involve, it's a change. It's going to involve some education, some awareness raising as well, to explain what's happening as well. So we want to give them as much time as we can about that.
And so if people, particularly young people, are interested to sort of track where this, this idea is up to and where you've got to with the process, what's the best way for them to do that?
I would love to hear from them, love to hear any opinions or suggestions they've got. I also recommend they contact their local member. Let them know what they think about the issue and their views to help as part of that process of the Assembly considering this radical and fantastic reform that we're looking at.
So if there's one thing you want to leave people with in terms of thinking about, this idea, what's your key message that you'd like to give people who may have only heard about this idea of expanding the vote for the first time?
My key message is talk to the 16 or 17-year-old you might have in your life, because giving them a voice is what this is all about. So listen to them instead of casting your own sort of perspectives onto them. That's what I would say.
Fantastic. Well, look, I don't know about you, but I'm really excited about this. With the young people that are in my life, I think that they have amazing ideas and contributions to make, and I think that if we can really respect their opinions and give them the ability to get involved in the political process, there seems to be a whole lot of upsides and not very many downsides. So, look, thank you so much, Andrew, for giving us a bit more information about where, what you've been doing in relation to this issue and where we're up to in the process. Really thanks everyone for tuning in, and really looking forward to, speaking to you again about other issues that we're working on in the Assembly in coming weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.